This is your Chargers linebacker, Dan Henley, and you're tuning in with Chargers Unleashed.
Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. Today's show, of course, is being brought to you by BetOnline, Aura Athletic Greens, and Rock Solid Sports Memorabilia. If this is your first time tuning in to the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein, it is good to see your face again, sir. Took a little bit of a vacation over the 4th of July weekend. Had a little bit of an extended weekend, which was very, very nice. Wanted just to say a quick thank you to Ryan Dyrud filling in last Wednesday with you on the show. Really appreciated that. And Dan, it's always, whenever we take these vacations, I feel like I haven't spoken or talked to you in, I know it's been a week since we've done this, but it feels like I haven't spoken to you in a month. And maybe that's just a culmination of this being still now July, still as we're just creeping up towards the beginning of training camp, just, inching ever closer, hoping to get to July 26th. But what the hell, man? It's good to see your face. Good to talk to you. We're back with a very interesting topic today. I'm really excited to get into it.
Yes. Welcome back to Chargers Unleashed. Jake, welcome back from vacation. Everybody, hope you had a great 4th of July. Independence Day was fun. I was stuck in traffic for about 2 hours getting home last night from 4th of July festivities. Fun episode today. We get to go into, there's a whole bunch of things that have Chargers fans excited. But
I like how you led it with that.
But there are many things, and as a Chargers fan, Jake, you, myself, avid fans who have been around the block for a bit, there are things that you can just expect, tale as old as time, that have plagued this team for recent years. We could probably extrapolate that to long ago. So we're going to kind of get into the things that must change this year. Things that have plagued this team for years past, that has costed this team countless victories, and we hope to see be resolved this year. So we got 4 categories of them to go over.
Have you ever Googled yourself and were shocked to see your personal information exposed on one of those public listing sites? Data brokers are making a fortune selling your information to robocallers, spammers, and others who want to learn more about you, like where you live.
We've been trying to reach you concerning your car's extended warranty.
That's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf, and brokers everywhere are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but they make it super hard to do. So let Aura handle that for you. You could try Aura for up to 2 weeks using this link that we're going to put up here on the screen. Aura also does so much more to protect you and your family from online threats that you cannot see. So make sure to check out aura.com/Chargers Unleashed to get a 14-day free trial and see if your personal information has been leaked online.
We're going to talk about the run game on offense and defense, talk about the second half offense or lack thereof. We're talking about red zone here for a bit, and then we've all heard this buzzword, explosiveness, again, or lack thereof on offense. Heavy data-driven approach on this one, so be on the lookout for some numbers here. So what needs to change is the topic of conversation. Jake, before we get into that, I'll kind of lead this one off. So over-under. Number of teams that scored more than the Chargers in the first half last year. I'll set the line at, for folks listening, watching, I'll set the line at 7.5. Over or under 7.5 teams that scored more than the Chargers in 2022 in the first half.
I mean, I know the answer, which may actually surprise some people as far as the first half goes.
So don't say it. Folks who are listening, over under. And why are we doing that, Jake?
It's under.
Oh, you let it out of the bag. That's okay. Jake, before we go further, let's talk about our friends over at Bet. He's like, yeah, it's over. No. Is it over?
I thought it was under.
I think it's over. It's under. Yes, it's under.
It's under. Yes.
Wow, we're off to a great start here on Chargers
Fantastic
Jake,
start.
hit me off the mic. Go ahead and talk about our friends over at Bet Online.
See, this is what happens when you don't do a show for over a week. You kind of lose these little nuances here. But one thing that we have not lost is Bet Online. I want to remind you guys it remains your number one source for all of your sport betting needs this season. Always the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports, including live betting options and your favorite casino and card games available to play right from your very own home. All you got to do to get into the action, go on over to betonline.ag today and use your mobile device to join. Be sure to use that promo code BELIEVE. That's BLEAV to receive your rewards. Bet Online, where the game starts.
So, Jake, let's start this one off by something that we've all heard about, and we don't have to keep burying this team and the 2022 performance, but we need to talk about what has to change.
Yep.
With this running game, both on offense and on defense. And you can give excuses, you can give rationale behind why it happened, at least on offense. You can't really on defense. You just can't. No matter what was the case, this rush defense was terrible last year. And it honestly hasn't been great for a while. This has to change. Jake, I will let you go first on this one. Why must the rush defense change before we get to the offense?
I mean, my God, dude. This obviously will translate into a lot of the other categories that we have, and reasons why some of these stats just are so misleading for the Chargers when you're looking at between the offense and the defense, as far as to say, like, why do we have so many issues last year in certain categories? The run defense just gets me, Dan. I just don't understand it. And this was before this team essentially lost 5 interior defensive linemen, whether we're talking by injury or by, organizational release, whatever you want to call it. This team had issues early on in this season, and we saw it. It almost felt like on a weekly basis. It was that 40-yard rip from opposing running backs to say, like, oh, there it is. Okay, well, that box has been checked for the game, and the running game didn't really get that much better. So the Chargers ended up yielding.
Here we go.
Here, especially when you talk about the total rushing yards, outside of just doing it yards per game, 2,478 rushing yards throughout the duration of the 2022 NFL season, which comes out to 145 rushing yards per game. I don't care how good your offense is if your defense is going to be allowing those type of opposing offenses to just run down your throat.
144 points, 144 yards per game. That's 27th in the NFL. Teams like the Giants, the Lions, the Bears, and the Texans are the company you keep.
That's basically it, Dan. And let alone, it still is a damn miracle. Thank God for the offense. And regardless of what we want to say about the offense in general for last year, they were what kept the Chargers alive and ultimately got them at their first playoff berth under the Brandon Staley regime. But still,
asterisk, first half offense, which we'll get to here in a bit.
Yeah,
first half offense.
That'll be explained big time. So, and that's why I was kind of preference by saying, it's like, regardless of what you want to say about the offense, we'll tell you a little bit about it here in a second. But Dan, you can't sustain playoff games like this. It's amazing that the Chargers made the playoffs with as bad of a run defense as that was. But it's for what the Chargers need to do this season. And if their goal is to ultimately end up making a push in the playoffs, we're talking about winning a game and possibly even stringing a few together, not just make the playoffs. We saw that last year. We saw what they're capable of doing it. Late in the season, this team showed a lot of resiliency. But when it gets down to the playoffs in general, running the ball and stopping the run are 2 huge crucial factors that are very big things in terms of separating a team that wins and a team that loses games. So this stat has to be improved, Dan. And you would think from the standpoint of how much we've harped on it, how much coverage has been around it going all the way back into early last season. Sebastian Joseph Day has already addressed this. We had Chris Rumpf on here last year addressing it, and he was very candid about how he personally felt about this team's run defense.
It sucked, quote unquote.
It's that has been beaten like a dead horse, essentially, that narrative. So
5.4 yards per game. Again, we talked about it. Worse than the NFL. Excuse me, 5.4 yards per attempt. I wish it was per game.
So you
and
would
Jake,
hope
it's also interesting. And I found this, Matt Money Smith had an interesting discussion about this last week on Chargers Weekly. And he talked about how like teams A, knew the run defense was bad, and B, ran it a bunch against this team. And I was looking at some statistics, and one of them I saw was percentage of opponents' yards accumulated via rushing. Now, Jake, there are teams like, Tennessee Titans, the 49ers, the Ravens, Cincinnati, Minnesota, where they're giving up the rushing defense percentages in terms of all total yards. Percent of those yards rushing were in like the low 20s to low 30s, roughly. So easy math. Let's say they give up 100 yards total. Tennessee gave up 21.86 yards on the ground for every 80-ish yards in the air. The Chargers are up, again, company you keep, with the Texans, the Bears, the Packers, the Saints, Cleveland, the Giants. Chargers were sixth most rushing yard percentage allowed, almost 42%. So
why
not only were the Chargers terrible
when you're running it that good against this,
when you're giving up that many yards per clip, and you're giving up that much percentage of your opponent's offense to rushing attempts, that's what gets you to like the awful times where your team just runs out of gas.
Mm-hmm.
You can't sustain that, like you said. And then you flip that. How do you even want to start with a rushing offense?
This is maybe the first stat of this show that really doesn't make any sense, because when you look what Austin Eckler did under the circumstances, it's fantastic for him. Once again, you had him on your fantasy team, you're doing just great. Him, Christian McCaffrey, top guys as far as running back scoring last year. But Dan, I don't know how you can properly extrapolate this. When it comes down to the rushing attack, I mean, when you look at this, if we were just to go simply off of rushing yards per game for this team,
not good.
It's not good.
Third worst.
And how did Austin Eckler put up these damn numbers? I don't know. I don't know how this happened.
Because it was just Austin Eckler putting up numbers. And even those rushing wise, I mean, they weren't great. All purpose, totally. You combine that and receiving, sure. 88.4 yards per game total from this rushing offense in 2022.
Oh, that's just vomit, dude. That is just something that has to improve. Now, obviously, there was probably a lot to do with that. You take Rashawn Slater out of this offense, that's obviously going to kick the running game down dramatically. Shifts in the offensive line between whether Corey Linsley or Trey Pipkins went in there was a lot of rotation along this offensive line. But it felt like, again, to me, that the Chargers wanted to stay still committed to the run as much as possible, even though it wasn't working. It was just such a bummer to see whether it was holes closed so quickly or the Chargers would make an attempt on a first down run and it would go absolutely nowhere. And then my favorite is when you literally are in 2nd and 10, and we're talking like this is week 14 now. This is not week 1. And you still choose to run the ball again. So your run offense is porous. You're trying to make it better, but it still just is not getting you anywhere. The best rushing game, arguably, that the Chargers had, Dan, was against the Rams last year in that blowout win.
Was that 70-yard Eckler run?
Yes. That was arguably the best rushing game that they had.
Because he had one rush for 70 yards.
Exactly. But statistically, it made it look that way.
And I think it's important to point out, like, they were, when I say 4th worst with 80-something yards per game, they were 5th worst in terms of attempts, 5th fewest rushing attempts in the NFL last year. So they weren't rushing well. They weren't rushing much, just 23.7 yards per attempt. They were third worst in yards per rush attempt. So 3.7 yards per attempt. They were third worst in yards per game, 88.4. And then they were fifth worst in rushing attempts per game. And then if you look at rushing play percentage, so percentage of this Chargers offense going to rush attempts, second fewest in the NFL, behind only Tampa Bay at 34%. So 65% of their offense was passing.
But it had to be.
But okay, why? But I think the part that makes this bad for the offense was when you're already pass heavy at 65% ish.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that your running game at only 35% is still that bad, like that's not sustainable. Like, and that kind of goes hand in hand with like the rush defense. Like, if you can't rush and keep clock on your side, give
Correct.
your defense a breather, your defense is going to be huffing the entire time.
Then this will touch on a point here in a second when we're talking about the second half performance of this team. But how many times did the Chargers have to play catch up once again last year? So in some circumstances, you had to abandon the run. And yeah, you had to go full blown pass just to even try to get victories last year. So I know it looks good to see Justin Herbert play Superman. And all of those moments are exciting, and statistically it looks great, and highlights look great for him. But this is where Kellen Moore is going to be, I think, so important to this team, is to bring a balance, but also bring a balance that's going to ultimately yield results and be productive. Dan, I went back and I looked at not just last year of what he did in Dallas. You go back to 2021. What he did with Dallas when that was the number one scoring offense in the league. And you look at what they did statistically from a passing offense and a rushing offense, they were extremely balanced. And if you could get a semblance of that to work with this team, specifically in the running offense, I would assume it's really hard to say that the Chargers are going to be at this same spot, if not worse.
Give me to
as
60.
What they were.
Give me to like 60-40.
Hell, tell me that you're going to elevate this stat at least to the middle of the pack. Hell, I'll take that.
60. So just for reference, if they get to 60-40, 60% pass, 40% rushing, that's up there with the likes of the Chiefs, 38% rushing, Dolphins, 38% rushing, Buffalo, 40. For almost 41, Jacksonville almost 41, Seattle almost 41. Like, good company.
Hell, get it to where Detroit was last year. With as much as Detroit was slinging the ball around with Jared Goff, they were still one of the better rushing offenses in the league last year in terms of yards per game. I would say that would be an attainable goal.
And they rushed 44% of the time, so they were very well balanced. And Jake, I think that the problem with this rushing offense, I don't necessarily know if it's not necessarily the lack of attempts. I think it's the lack of production. Which, I mean, I would like to see more attempts, but I get why they're not attempting more when the production sucks. But Austin Eckler, like, it's one thing if you've got Derrick Henry, who's getting, 1,600 yards rushing, and then the guy behind him is getting, 250, whatever, as kind of the backup guy. But when your lead back is getting 915 yards rushing on 204 attempts, that's when you're needing. Do you remember back in the day with the Panthers? It was Jonathan Stewart and who's the other running back?
D'Angelo Williams. Wasn't it? Yes.
Two-headed monster. And that was like the definition of two-headed monster. Like both those guys were going to town. And you were getting like, 1,600 yards easy by those guys? 915 yards by Austin Eckler, 287 for Josh Kelly, Justin Herbert, your third leading rusher, 147 yards, Sony Michel, 106 yards, Isaiah Spiller, 41 yards, Larry Roundtree, 19 yards. Let's throw in Xander Horvath there for 8 yards. Keenan Allen had 8 yards.
I guess we could say one guarantee that we know that will 100% improve is that Isaiah Spiller will have more than 40 yards rushing this season.
Well, the crazy part, what's interesting is everybody talked about like they want to see Justin Herbert scramble and get out in the pocket more and like use his mobility. And like if you just had your blinders on and said Justin Herbert's the third leading rusher on this team, people would be like, no way. Like that goes to show how bad the rushing offense was when you had Justin Herbert with broken ribs and cartilage and stuff not running. Let's just be real. He wasn't running.
No.
As your third leading rusher. Like you can't do that. It has to change. And I think this is one that if I had to put money on one of these that is going to change, there's one more in here that I think that I'm probably more bullish on. I think the rush offense is going to get better. I'm pretty confident in that happening this year. Run defense and run offense, like the run defense, like I got questions. There's nothing that leads me to believe they're going to be better other than faith and health, really.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of unknowns as it relates to the run defense because while you are getting some guys back from injury and Tito and Austin Johnson, hopefully everything goes well with their recovery as we get towards training camp. It's also reloaded with a number of guys that are kind of unknown, but I would say that they are somewhat deeper. So, because the competition, I think, is going to be a hell of a lot fiercer for those interior defensive guys. Eric Kendricks, I think, is obviously going to help in that circumstance as well. So you'd hope just collectively, they know that they have to get better in that. So whether, as you're saying, Dan, by faith or health or whatever the hell it is, just as a mentality, again, if I'm the defensive coordinator of this team, first thing I put up on the board is this is what we're going to emphasize that we're getting better.
Yeah,
like
and
no question.
like I say faith and health. Like at least on offense, you got a whole new scheme. You got a guy who's proven success. Like you got someone who's coming in here and changing things on defense, other than health, and adding what Gerard Clark, Nick Williams, Scott Batlock, all like very deep depth pieces. Sure.
Still
The only thing that's changed. The only thing that changed is people are coming back healthy. And some of them aren't already healthy yet. Austin Johnson and Tito are still rehabbing.
Right.
So cool. Okay. So Jake,
good.
next. A lot of emphasis has been talked about the third quarter offense, which has been atrocious. I would argue it's not just the third quarter. I think it's the second half in total. And I'll give stats here to back this up, but Jake, the second half offense on the team sucked. First half was pretty darn good, honestly. You go back and look at it. And then for whatever reason,
these stats are disgusting.
This hurt. So just to put in context, Jake, so first half points per game. Do you know the Chargers? We talked about the over-under earlier in the show. There were only 3 NFL teams that had more points per game in the first half than the Chargers. The Eagles at 18.5, the Chiefs at 15.5, and the Bills at 15.3. Right after that, you got the Chargers at 15.2, got the Bengals 13.9, Dolphins 13.6, the Niners 13.6. All of those teams, aside maybe from Miami because of the injury issue, but all of those teams, wagons. Philly, Chiefs, Bills, Bengals, Niners. Chargers are 4th best first half points per game. Second half points per game, Jake. 8. They go from 15.2 to 8. Now, the company you keep, theme here, second half points per game allowed. They are with teams like the Bears, the Texans, the Colts, the Broncos,
My
the
God.
Steelers, the Rams, the Titans. Now,
The
notice the
disgusting
theme here. And like the Chiefs, just for reference, we talked about them being juggernauts. 3rd best second half points per game. The Bills, 7th best. Niners, 9th. Bengals, 10th. They don't go from 4th to 28th? Explain that to me.
What really hurts about that stat, Dan, is those teams that you just rattled off a second ago. Because you connect those teams to the quarterbacks that are playing for those teams. And to lump in Justin Herbert with that group, it just almost feels like sacrilege.
I don't want to touch
like
that.
It shouldn't happen. Like, what Twilight Zone episode are we living in right now? Listening to that, I remember the drought that this team had before they ultimately ended up scoring a second half touchdown. I think it was actually that Rams game that they finally did it. And it felt like for the longest time, like the Chargers hadn't scored a second half touchdown since, Nixon had been president. It literally felt like that long. And it felt like a huge celebration when they finally just got that monkey off their shoulder. But it's just like, how do you have a stat like that consistent for so many weeks that is just so volatile when it comes to the difference between winning and losing games? How do you go from being that efficient and being able to put points up on the board in the first half like that to then just absolutely nosediving?
I said third quarter, fourth quarter. Third quarter, we talked about how abysmal they were. 2.9 points per third quarter. Again, 29th in the NFL. No one talks about the fourth quarter. They're 25th.
Not much better.
So, sure, they're marginally better, but not much. Not much. Now, again, so this all is kind of interesting that all of this kind of blends together, because if your offense is not rushing, not able to sustain drives, your defense is tired, then your offense gets one-dimensional when the defense gives up the lead, having them then pass. When your guys are injured and you can't rush, what are you going to do? Now, some of that, a lot of that, you can kind of account to coaching, can account to scheme, can account to injuries, sure. People don't want to talk about this, but at some point, and you kind of tiptoed around it a little bit, and I might tiptoe a little bit closer to the water here.
Go ahead.
At some point, if your name is Justin Herbert and you have these skills, and I understand he's hurt, and so that's like a big disclaimer here.
I'm happy that you're saying this, by the way.
But you can't let that happen. You cannot be a generational quarterback with a team on your back and give up 25th least, fourth worst points per game in the third and fourth quarter. That's half the game. And then to make it crazier is you can't go from being fourth best in the first half to being that bad in the second half and say, oh, well, it's because he's hurt. No, it doesn't work that way. He was hurt in the first half.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, some of that, you, Jake, we've talked about it for weeks, talked about I wish this team would step on the throat. I wish they'd be more explosive. We'll talk about that. I wish this team would be able to sustain drives. I wish we'd be more creative. At some point, though, it's the same team. And to be that hot and cold over the entire season, from first half to second half, that to me, I think, is the biggest red flag and the biggest, that's why Lombardi's not here anymore. Now, is it fair to put all of the blame on him? No, I don't think it is. But if there's a reason, if there's a nail in the coffin, coach, explain to me how we are one of the best 5 in the NFL in the first half, worst 5 in the second half. Make it make sense. So that's the second half offense has to change. Has to change. Now, Jake, you're going to have some fun with this one.
I'm very excited about this particular stat.
Let's talk about the trees. Okay. Kellen Moore talked about having to throw into a different, what was it? Different airspace.
Jet stream.
Jet stream. There we go.
Yes.
Chargers have their own jet stream with the guys on this team. And that was even further extrapolated when you have Quentin Johnston added to this team. Jake, let's talk about the red zone offense.
Where do we start? Where do we start?
How it wasn't good, maybe?
Maybe this goes hand in hand, Dan, with what the stats you just said about why Joe Lombardi is not here anymore. Because now you bring in the offensive coordinator who led the team that had the highest red zone percentage in terms of scoring touchdowns goes last season with the Dallas Cowboys, that being Kellen Moore. But Dan, okay, so just off the top of your head, you can probably go through this. You can probably say, okay, we know Kansas City is going to be top in there as far as those stats goes. Philly, obviously. Detroit was an air raid show last year in terms of how they performed. They look great. Cincinnati, obviously. Buffalo, yes. Dan, listen to some of these teams that were better in the red zone in terms of scoring touchdowns than the Chargers with Justin Herbert. Let me emphasize that once again.
Oh, no.
Atlanta had a better percentage than the Chargers in the red zone. The Rams, who had quarterback problems the entire year, were better than the Chargers in the red zone in terms of scoring touchdowns. Denver, for as much heat as Russell Wilson took last year and how much, I guess, the laughing stock in terms of expectations goes, they were better in terms of a red zone offense than the Chargers were. Chicago, with their lack thereof of weapons that you would want to say for Justin Fields that they were a better red zone offense. Carolina, Arizona, they were better in terms of red zone percentage in scoring touchdowns than the Chargers were. The Chargers were 18th in the league with 54% in the red zone. Why is
54%? What was 54%?
54% in terms of scoring touchdowns.
Okay.
They were 18th in the league, which is right around the same place that Jacksonville was, Cleveland, New Orleans, teams like that. That is, as you like to say, the company that the Chargers were keeping in terms of scoring touchdowns in the red zone. How, when you have Justin Herbert, does this happen?
But Jake, what's the weird part is on that red zone, they had the 5th most red zone scoring attempts per game.
That's where this just reads like a damn Rubik's Cube. This doesn't make any sense.
5th most attempts, 18th in scoring percentage.
And you come away with that type of a touchdown percentage. That is horrible. That's horrible. So you'd have to believe that Kellen Moore is going to get this team above 54% in the red zone. With the weapons that Justin Herbert has, with the patiently waiting that this Chargers fan base has been waiting for to see the usage of 2 tight ends, namely Gerald Everett and Donald Parham, used properly in the red zone this year. Take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. Red zone scoring attempts, the fact that they're 5th best in that, but in total points per game, they're 12th. And this is the interesting, and this actually perfectly blends into the lack of explosiveness. If you have the top 5, if you're in the top 5 of red zone attempts per game, and you're not scoring amongst the top of the league, that's basically telling me that you're not scoring from outside of the red zone, which clearly the Chargers were not.
It makes you wonder if the Chargers did not have either Dustin Hopkins or Cameron Dicker on this team last year. Could you imagine?
Oh yeah, put 2 years ago.
Oh my Lord. That the Chargers finishing record is going to be drastically different. And there is probably no playoffs for this team if it's not for a few of those kicks that they made. And again, because they couldn't score in the red zone.
And again, and people, and it's like there's a lot to this, right? Like Rashawn Slater not being there obviously impacts the run game and impacts bootleg opportunities, impacts things that you can do on the outside, running wise specifically, or even pass for that matter.
But then even with all that, to your point, how many attempts that they had. So it's like, regardless of all that, they still got to the red zone.
Yes.
They just couldn't get into the party.
But this is the issue though. Like, Donald Parham, one of the trees, was out for a large part of that season. Mike Williams in and out and or not targeted. Justin Herbert, for his size, hurt. They're not going to risk that. Austin Eckler, I wouldn't say is really red zone goal line running back. And we sure as hell know there wasn't another one on the team.
Hey, for fantasy, it didn't matter. He was second consecutive year being that high in terms of points himself.
Sure.
He figured it out. But like I've been saying, none of these stats make sense. But when you really just do a 50-foot view of this,
it's a problem.
Like, it's a huge problem when you have 10 at the quarterback spot.
And I don't know, like a part of me wants to just like take the 2022 season and just like light it on fire. Cause like there were so many anomalies in this one, which we've talked about a bunch of them, but like it doesn't make sense. And like the things that make sense to me was like, all right, this team was hurt. Like that's not an excuse. It's just a fact. Like they were very much hurt last season and overcame all of that and still made the playoffs and still should have freaking won the playoff game if it wasn't for some catastrophic sadness. I'm just sadness. I'll keep it PG.
That was a very nice word to use. I thought you were going to totally go a different route. Kind of wish you would have gone the different route, but kudos to you for staying professional.
They overcame all of that, still got 10 wins. So it's hard to sit here and say, "Oh, I wish they were more explosive last year." While like I agree with that on principle, like, who? Like, could they brought in John Hightower? Sure. Like, could they have brought in some other speed guys? Sure. But like in reality, but then you go back and say, even when those guys were in, were they really that explosive? Not really. So I kind of just want, and maybe this is how the team takes it. Like, make this make sense. And also never let this happen again.
No.
And then again, Kellen Moore, please help. Please help. And I do think one thing that he is very much known for is creating mismatches. And that is something that this Chargers offense did not do, especially in the red zone. And now you add a Quentin Johnston to this mix, which I think is a huge red zone threat. You add Darius Davis potentially and Jalen Guyton. Not necessarily Jalen Guyton for red zone, but Darius Davis. Imagine him doing some of those jet sweep end around Joe Reed, Andre Roberts.
The one that Joe
Michael
Reed got.
Michael Bandy that shouldn't have been doing it. Like, you know, like those types of plays. I don't think you're going to see the same style, but those types of plays you see from the Chiefs on the goal line, all those misdirection plays, I think you'll see a little wrinkle of that.
Just get me close. Get me some similar stats to what Dalton Schultz put up the last 2 years in that Dallas offense.
From who? From Everett?
Whether it's from Everett or for Parham. And even if you want to just pigeonhole it to touchdowns. He was
some tight end touchdowns.
Him and CeeDee Lamb were huge last year when it came to scoring. That was a bulk of their scoring. You go back 2 years ago with Dallas, they actually spread the scoring opportunities around big time, which is what I would really hope for in terms of what for Kellen Moore's sake, this is probably the biggest cachet of weapons that he has had the opportunity to coach. And back in the days when the Dallas Cowboys had Amari Cooper, Cedric Wilson, CeeDee Lamb, Dalton Schultz, all as offensive passing weapons. And I haven't even talked about it, what Ezekiel Elliott was to them in the passing game those previous years as well. If you can replicate a season like that to where you can, Dan, just for context, all four of those guys that I named, they got 24 touchdowns between them that 2 years ago. Not bad when you talk about spreading the ball around. So if you could do that now, and especially if we're talking the red zone and with the tight ends, and as you said, Gerald Everett, Donald Parham getting that 6 to 8 touchdown range for the season, I like that. Like the sound of that.
Let's parlay this into, I think, what everyone's hoping for. And Chargers social media team, pundits, critics, everybody, fans, Gecko is talking about this probably at this point. Like, can we see some air under the ball? Like, I know he's got a laser, I know he could throw it on a rope, but like I'd rather see it being thrown on like a rainbow. Like just nice arc, 50 yards would be nice to see every now and then. Maybe Quentin Johnston is on the receiving end. Darius Davis is underneath it. Keenan Allen on the sideline for like a nice post route. Justin Herbert maybe like doing a little bootleg action. Throwing it down to Guyton for 60 yards against the Giants. Like, can we see something that is not just having to pull teeth painstakingly over and over and over again? 9-yard clips per pass play. Again, Jake, last year, yards per completion, Chargers, 26th in the NFL. Again, company you keep. They're with the Pittsburgh freaking Steelers. Daniel Jones, who had an up year, still not great. The Rams, the Colts, and the Cardinals. That's who they're around. Then you look at the other side. Yards per completion, Miami, we all know about them. 12.2, number one. Then you got the Niners, the Bills, the Eagles, the Chiefs, and surprisingly, the Panthers at 12 and 11 points or 12 and 11 yards per completion. You said it before. You cannot have Justin Herbert now healthy with these weapons, with this offensive line, with the lack of running game in its head, only throw for 9 yards per completion.
I don't know.
This sucks freaking talk.
I'm
hoping
this is kind of like
for this, but I'm still not like I was not expecting to feel this like.
I know, because it just brings you back to what the Chargers did or lack thereof in 2022. And it's like, it's to your point, this is kind of the joke that I made on the Chargers chat episode where I'm like 28 weeks later, just get us from January 14th, which was the Chargers' last playoff game, to July 26th, almost to the day. It's 28 weeks later. Let's just wipe our hands of it. Let's turn the page and let's exercise these demons and hope for a much better result. It just doesn't make any damn sense to me, Dan. And I get it. I think from Lombardi's standpoint, what he was doing, given some of the injuries that were taking place, specifically with Justin Herbert, you go back to especially that Jacksonville game, where you lost Rashawn Slater and Joey Bosa, and Justin Herbert's coming off of that Thursday night game against the Chiefs where he was injured. And obviously he's not 100%. And he's just back there still getting tattooed because his offensive line cannot protect him. So I'm sure that he tailored this offense to, be a little bit easier for Justin to navigate in terms of a pain threshold and what he could do physically. But still, I go back to my original point. Even despite all those injuries, how efficient was Justin Herbert, even still when he would be getting outside the pocket, running bootleg, throwing the ball? I mean, he's shown that since his rookie season. He is lethal when he is outside the pocket for some of those explosive plays. Thankfully, we started to see him just a little bit more frequently as we got later in the year and Herbert started to get a little bit healthier. But again, to my thought process is, how are you game planning? You cannot pigeonhole yourself into this type of game plan when you don't have a defense that is supporting you. If the Chargers had a Philadelphia Eagles defense or a San Francisco 49ers defense, maybe that game plan could have worked. But when you're not scoring in the third quarter, or the fourth quarter, your red zone your red zone offense is just absolutely horrendous. You can't stick with this game plan and expect good winning results. That's going to catch up with you. So in this circumstance, Dan, and again, here's another reason for optimism for Kellen Moore, because Dak Prescott last year finished the season tied for 5th in big time throw rate. So with Justin Herbert back healthy, with what we're assuming is those little adjustments in the mechanics to his throwing style, obviously adding Quentin Johnston to this offense, Mike Williams and Keenan Allen back yet. Josh Palmer, I kind of feel like, is the forgotten guy. If you have Jalen Guyton still as your legitimate fastest guy still on this roster, your deep threat, and maybe you throw in Darius Davis a little bit as well. I can't fathom this not looking like just a completely different offense next year.
Yeah. And I don't know how like talk about stats that really piss you off. We talk about explosiveness and we talk about a lot of things on this episode as we're wrapping up. Jake, we talked about the rushing game and the rush offense and rush defense. Like looking at just this stat alone, if you just take a magnifying glass to rushing yards given up versus had, they rushed last year for 1,500 yards, 1,524. Gave up almost 1,000 yards more than that. So they rushed for 1,524, gave up 2,478 rushing yards. Their rushing yards per attempt, 3.8. They gave up 5.4. They had 89.6 yards per game rushing, gave up 145.8 yards per game to opposing teams.
That's not winning football. It's not winning football.
That's definitely losing football.
Yeah.
And looking at that, that's why that's the Justin Herbert bump. If they didn't have Justin Herbert, imagine what they would be doing if Daniel Jones was their quarterback. No offense to Daniel Jones, but come on. So rushing offense and rushing defense. Second half offense, red zone, and explosiveness. These things have to change. Of these four, what is the least likely or the most at risk to not change?
I kind of run it back to the first topic we talked about, Dan. With the run defense and the rushing offense, I feel very confidently that the rushing offense will improve, not just from coaching scheme, but from personnel as well. So I'm confident in that. But you said the one big question mark is that rushing defense. So what is Derek Ansley going to do to improve this? Because essentially you still have your same starters. One in particular is coming back from injury. Yes, you've reloaded your depth pieces, which is good. So you have invested more in that. But all these investments as of today are still technically question marks. Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do to improve that? That one, if it improves, it may not take a huge jump in improvement. Which I hope to God I'm wrong on that. If you can at least get that stat to middle of the pack, then I think that what
average.
Average. With what you should have on this offense should be able to balance it out, and the Chargers should be able to be in a much better position to win more games because of it.
Yeah, I would say, we have the running defense and offense kind of in the same category here. So obviously I think the run defense is going to kind of skew that one down a bit. The red zone offense one, I think I'm less bullish on that than I am the explosiveness we're going to see and the second half offense that we're going to see. I don't know what the red zone offense is going to look like because I think he's going to tailor it to this scheme. But I do think that at the end of the day, it's either going to be the rushing defense or the red zone offense that are the most likely, in my opinion, to not improve. Again, we hope they all improve. But the best chance to not is probably those. Jake, we got through it. The more and more we dove through those stats, I'm like, man, you can't. It's hard to summarize this stuff and make it make sense.
Yeah.
Other than to say, it just didn't make sense.
The only thing that makes sense is that nothing makes sense.
Okay. We did it. I'm all sweaty now. I feel gross. Jake, what else do you want to tell the great friends of Chargers Unleashed listeners, viewers, before we get out of here?
I mean, I hope that this officially closes the book. I know we're 3 weeks before training camp and, there's not much football news. We're kind of just all waiting for this to get going to officially get excited for the 2023 NFL season. But I don't ever want to talk about stats like this ever again as it relates to this team.
Yeah. And you know what I'm honestly going to do is I think I'm going to use this as I'm going to snap the line at a few times during training camp, during the regular season. around these 4 or 5 bullets: rushing offense, rushing defense, second half offense, red zone offense, and explosiveness. And what are they doing to combat these struggles? And if there isn't much, we got problems. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on come training camp. How is this running offense going? You can't really get much from rushing defense, honestly. Rushing's hard to get in preseason, or at least training camp, maybe a little preseason. Red zone you can get, explosiveness you can get. But, like, this stuff has to change. Jake, I'm glad we're back. This has been fun. For Jake Hefner, you can find him at Jake D. Hefner, myself at DNW Sports. Can't wait as the season continues. We have some fun things coming up, more giveaways to announce soon, special guests upcoming. Stay tuned there. Training camp is just a few weeks away. We're so excited. Dog days are almost over. Jake, it's been a pleasure. Talk to you, all right, man?
Sounds like a plan.
Okay. Bye, ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages. Have a great rest of the afternoon, evening, or good night. We'll talk to you next time on Chargers Unleashed.